Psychoanalysis. What is that? We all think of Freud when we think of psychoanalysis. It's a theoretical framework when describing personality, mental functioning, and psychological development, particularly in the interest of psychopathology. Therefore, psychoanalysis looks at it's that long-term therapy you think about with someone laying on the couch and then the psychoanalyst sitting behind them, giving them interpretations of what they think the problem may be. The psychoanalyst is supposed to invite the patient to start thinking about things that they've never thought about before. Um, but more old school psychotherapy or psychoanalysis was the patient would sit there and the psychotherapist would say nothing. They would wear the same thing and they would try to keep everything very controlled, almost like an experiment, where the only intervention, the independent variable, the thing influencing the patient being dependent on the therapist, the independent variable, would be the interpretation. So purely interpretations, and the therapist, after giving the interpretation, the client is supposed to introspect. Introspection is a key word. You want to remember that in your vocabulary because introspection is the process in which the patient looks within, or whoever the individual is looks within and tries to use their experiences and their knowledge and their understanding of themselves to look inside for the answers and hopefully cure deep-seated psychopathology. Let's move on. In psychoanalysis, which emotion can be attributed to a reflection of the unconscious wish? Psychoanalysts would posit that reflections of our unconscious wishes, so what we're wishing unconsciously that we're not in touch with, that we don't really have that contact, that conscious thought about, just in the back of our mind. To reflect that, it's shown physically and behaviorally in our fears. Our fears are reflections of unconscious wishes, so we're not really registered with them. We're just afraid of it. Behaviorally, we're afraid of something. We may or may not know why, but psychoanalysts would say that your fear is actually, we do know why you're afraid of that, because something happened a long time ago, and maybe it's a unconscious wish. Maybe it's something that you secretly hope for, but now you're avoiding, and in the form of a fear, now you're avoiding it because acting out on it would be socially, I guess, when you don't like something, when society puts it down or makes fun of you or could criticize you for it, all these negative things that can happen around this, that's what creates a fear. It's you suppressing something that you unconsciously desire, unconsciously wish, because if you actually overtly wished this, you would be looked at differently. You'd be looked at crazy, mad, gross, whatever it is, because maybe the unconscious behaves in weird ways that aren't publicly acceptable. It's just the id. You've heard of the id, the ego, and the superego, Freud's different little terms there. Well, the id right there is not always rational. It just acts on what it wants to do. Like, there's Oedipus and Electra complexes in psychoanalysis. The Oedipus complex is that, like, sons want to do their mother, and the Electra complex is the exact opposite, where daughters fantasize about their father, and there's this competition between the opposite sexes where maybe the son hates the father because he's with the mother, or the daughter hates the mother because she wants the father. All weird stuff, but Freud was sort of out there with his ideas. And speaking for the unconscious, he says there's no bounds on it. It acts in these ways that we oppress and we suppress and we repress, in essence, because we would receive a lot of negative reinforcement had we actually been overt about it. So there's more than you ever wanted to know about fear as a reflection of the unconscious. Next, lack of education and sophistication are risk factors for Freud's rural patients to develop hysteria. So rural patients would just in this sense, in this time and day, in the city where you have the industrial workers and the more educated workers versus the farm workers who didn't really come to the city to obtain the higher jobs that required more education. They had more rudimentary jobs, more elementary jobs where they used their hands and didn't need to go to school to learn to use their hands. They just learned it from other people. But that's neither here nor there. The risk factors for rural patients would develop hysteria. Freud loved to throw out the diagnosis of hysteria because, mind you, this is before any DSM-5 was around, before these official APA and everything was around. So hysteria was the general term coined to describe mental illness. And as I said hysteria, it looks like I set off Siri. Okay. Freud's thought was that hysterical symptoms were not due to constitutional weaknesses, but rather were mechanisms unresolved inner conflicts. So hysteria was a coping mechanism for an unresolved inner conflict. That sounds sort of like what we were talking about with the unconscious and fears and inner wishes and inner desires. It's just a coping mechanism, in essence, to resolve these things that went unresolved. And they went unresolved because we don't want to talk about them because of social pressures, and we don't want to be looked at as someone that has something wrong with them. Freud thought that hysterical symptoms were actually coping mechanisms to resolve these inner conflicts, and pathology helps Freudians understand the broader scope of human meaning. So human meaning can be defined by pathology because it's sort of like your case history. If you do have this pathology, it tells a lot about what happened in the past, of course, with psychoanalysis. The conscious represents only a small portion of mental life. So this is a great analogy that was taught in my class by Professor Maurice Eagle, great guy, full of interesting stories. Imagine a dark room, right? So this is my analogy for the unconscious and the conscious, and it was passed along to me through class, through lecture. You're in a dark room and you have a flashlight. You shine the flashlight and you can see part of the room now. You can see part of the room, and as you're illuminating this beam of light in this dark room, you see nothing except for the beam of light. Everything else is darkness. This beam of light can be assimilated to the conscious, right? And then the rest of the dark room is the unconscious by default. So you have your conscious and your unconscious, and this whole giant room is black. That's your unconscious. We're not in touch with it. We don't see it. And to see it means that you're aware of it. To see something, you're aware of it. You understand what's going on. It's in your visual field. That's the beam of light. That's your consciousness. I'm consciously aware of that speck on the wall because I can see it. However, we can't really see the unconscious, so all we can do is try to introspect, there's that word again, and move our beam of light, our consciousness, and look at different pockets of the unconsciousness. Here, that part of the wall, that part of the wall, that part of the wall, and try to understand our unconscious through consciously examining it. But it's hard though, and that's why psychoanalysis is sort of about in the first place, to try to understand the unconscious through introspection and interpretations. So therefore, the conscious represents only a small portion of mental life, whereas the unconscious represents most of it.